Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. Tonight we journey not to the Troy of epic poems and legendary heroes, but to a place far older and far more real. We travel back beyond the shadow of myth, beyond the echoes of Homer's verses, to a time when Troy was not a story but a living, breathing city built of stone and timber, inhabited by real people who knew nothing of the destiny their home would hold in the imagination of future ages. This is the city as it truly was, before the songs were sung, before the legends took shape in the firelight of ancient halls. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Imagine standing at the edge of the Aegean Sea on a morning over 3,000 years ago. The sun rises slowly over the eastern horizon, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. Behind you rises a great fortified hill, a citadel of massive stone walls and wooden towers that commands the landscape for miles in every direction. This is Troy, known in its own time as Walusa or Ilios, a place of immense strategic importance, a crossroads between continents, a city that controlled one of the most valuable maritime passages in the ancient world. The people who lived here spoke a language we can barely reconstruct, worshipped gods whose names we struggle to pronounce, and lived lives of labor, ritual, ambition, and fear that would have been utterly familiar to us in their fundamental humanity, yet strange in almost every particular detail. Tonight we will walk through this city as it might have been around 1300 BCE, during what archaeologists call Troy's Xerxes, the most prosperous and architecturally impressive phase of the settlement's long history. We will explore its streets and its rituals, its trade networks and its crafts, its daily routines and its moments of crisis. We will meet not heroes but merchants, not demigods but craftspeople, not epic warriors but simply soldiers doing their duty on the walls. This is history stripped of its later embellishments, a portrait of Bronze Age life in one of the most fascinating cities of the ancient world. So settle in now, let the noise of the modern world fade away, and allow yourself to drift back across the centuries to a place that once stood at the very center of its world, a city that was powerful and prosperous long before it became immortal. The world into which Troy was born was not the dark, mysterious realm of myth that later ages would imagine. It was a world of sophisticated civilizations, of international diplomacy, of long-distance trade and complex political alliances. This was the late Bronze Age, a time when great empires stretched across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, connected by networks of commerce and communication that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. To understand Troy, you must first understand this wider world, for the city did not exist in isolation but was part of a vast web of relationships that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia, from Crete to the distant shores of the Black Sea. The Bronze Age Aegean was dominated by several major powers, each controlling territories and resources, each maintaining diplomatic relations with the others, through a system of treaties, marriages, and carefully calibrated gift exchanges. In Egypt, the new kingdom pharaohs ruled from their magnificent capital at Thebes, sending their armies north into Syria and their traders west across the sea. In Anatolia, the heartland of modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire had risen to become one of the great powers of the age, its capital at Hattusa, a sprawling complex of temples, palaces, and archives, filled with thousands of clay tablets recording treaties, laws, and the daily business of empire. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean kingdoms, centered on palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, were growing in wealth and power, their distinctive pottery spreading throughout the Mediterranean, their linear B tablets recording inventories of bronze, livestock, and tribute. The Mediterranean Sea itself was less a barrier than a highway in this age. Ships moved constantly between ports, carrying cargoes of copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, perhaps as far as Afghanistan or Cornwall, olive oil from Crete, grain from Egypt, purple dye from the Levantine coast, and countless other goods. These were not simple trading vessels but sophisticated craft capable of navigating hundreds of miles of open water, their captains and crews skilled professionals who knew the winds, the currents, the safe anchorages, and the dangerous reefs along every major route. Maritime trade was the lifeblood of Bronze Age civilization, and the control of strategic points along these routes meant wealth and power. Troy's position was perhaps the most strategic of all. The city stood on a hill overlooking the southern entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and ultimately to the Black Sea beyond. In ancient times, this passage was even more treacherous than it is today, with strong currents, unpredictable winds, and dangerous shoals. Ships traveling north from the Aegean often found it impossible to sail against the southward flowing current and the prevailing northeasterly winds. They would beach at Troy, waiting for days or even weeks for the right conditions, and during this time they needed provisions, repairs, and shelter. Troy provided all of this and charged handsomely for it. The city's wealth was built not just on agriculture or manufacturing but on its ability to extract tolls, harbor fees, and trade from the constant flow of maritime traffic through the Dardanelles. The surrounding landscape was fertile and well-watered, quite different from the dry, windswept plain that visitors see today. In the Bronze Age, the coastline was closer to the citadel, and the Scamander River, flowing past the city's lower town, was navigable for small craft. The plain below the citadel was agricultural land, worked by the farming communities who owed allegiance and tribute to the city above. To the east and south rose the mountains of the Trod, forested slopes that provided timber for shipbuilding and construction, fuel for the city's workshops, and hunting grounds for the elite. The climate was mild, with wet winters and hot, dry summers, perfect for the cultivation of grain, olives, and grapes. The people who built and inhabited Troy were part of the broader Anatolian cultural world, more closely connected to the civilizations of the East than to the Mycenaean Greeks who would later claim the city's destruction as their own achievement. The Hittite archives, discovered in the 20th century and painstakingly translated, mention a place called Wilusa, located in the far west of Anatolia, which most scholars now agree was Troy. These archives reveal that Wilusa was a significant political entity, important enough to have treaties with the Hittite Empire, to be involved in diplomatic disputes, and to have its own kings who corresponded with the great powers of the age. The ruler of Wilusa, addressed in one Hittite text as Alexandu, may be the distant historical echo of the name Alexander, later associated in myth with Paris, one of the princes of legendary Troy. The diplomatic correspondence of the age reveals a world of careful protocol and mutual respect among rulers. Kings addressed each other as brothers, sent lavish gifts of gold, ivory, and fine textiles, arranged marriages between their children, and negotiated carefully over the treatment of merchants, fugitives, and disputed territories. This was a world where international law, such as it was, depended on personal relationships and the careful maintenance of honor and reputation. A city like Troy, controlling a vital choke point of maritime trade, would have been deeply involved in these networks, receiving embassies from distant courts, sending its own representatives to negotiate treaties, and participating in the complex diplomatic dance that kept the Bronze Age world functioning. But this world, for all its sophistication and complexity, was also fragile. It depended on the continued flow of trade, on the maintenance of political stability, on the careful management of resources and relationships. It was a world built on bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, and the interruption of either metal's supply could bring economic catastrophe. It was a world where crop failures could mean famine, where disease could devastate populations, where conflicts over resources or territory could escalate into destructive wars. The great palace archives, with their meticulous records and confident tone, give an impression of stability and order. But beneath this surface lurked constant anxieties about food security, military threats, and the favor of the gods. Into this world, Troy fitted as a prosperous and strategically vital city-state, neither a great empire like the Hittites nor a minor village, but something in between. A regional power whose wealth and importance came from its unique position at the intersection of maritime routes and continental trade networks. The city that archaeologists have uncovered, layer by layer, reveals a place that grew and changed over centuries, building ever more impressive fortifications, expanding its lower town to accommodate a growing population, and accumulating the wealth that came from its control of one of the ancient world's most important maritime passages. This was the real Troy, the Troy before the legends, and it is to this city, on a morning over 3,000 years ago, that we now turn our attention. You approach Troy from the south, following a well-worn road that leads across the plain toward the citadel. The road is not paved but packed hard by the passage of countless feet, hooves, and cartwheels over many years. On either side, fields of barley and emmer wheat ripple in the morning breeze, nearly ready for harvest. The air is already warm, carrying with it the dry, dusty smell of late summer and the distant tang of the sea. As you draw closer, the citadel rises before you, dominating the landscape with an authority that is both architectural and political. The walls of Troy are the first thing that seizes your attention, and they are unlike anything you have seen before in your travels through the Bronze Age world. They are built not of mud brick like many contemporary fortifications, but of massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, cut and fitted with extraordinary precision. The technique is called ashlar masonry, and it requires immense labor, sophisticated engineering knowledge, and access to skilled stone workers. The blocks are laid in regular courses, creating walls that rise in some places to a height of more than 5 meters, their faces battered, meaning they slope inward slightly from bottom to top, adding to their stability and defensive strength. These are not hastily erected defenses, but works of monumental architecture, statements of power and permanence, meant to impress and intimidate all who approach. The walls follow the natural contours of the hill, creating an irregular circuit that encloses the citadel's highest point. At intervals along the walls, towers project outward, providing positions from which defenders can observe the approaches and rain projectiles down on any attackers foolish enough to assault these formidable defenses. The towers are not entirely of stone, but have upper stories of timber and mud brick, lighter materials that reduce the weight on the stone foundations and provide flexibility in case of earthquake, a constant danger in this seismically active region. You enter the citadel through the main gate on the southern side, a structure that is itself a small fortress. The gate passage is not straight but angled, forcing anyone entering to turn, slowing any potential assault and exposing attackers to fire from multiple directions. The massive wooden doors are open now in peacetime, pulled back into recesses in the walls, but you can see the heavy bronze hinges and the channels in the stone where locking bars would slide into place to seal the entrance. The threshold beneath your feet is worn smooth by generations of passage, a single massive stone that has borne the weight of warriors, merchants, farmers, priests, and kings. Inside the walls, the citadel is not a single unified space, but a complex landscape of buildings, courtyards, streets, and open areas arranged on terraces that step up the hillside. The architecture is sophisticated, making efficient use of the limited space within the walls. The largest structures are built close to the citadel's highest point, their foundations cut into the bedrock, their walls rising 2 or even 3 stories. These are the palaces and administrative buildings, the residences of Troy's ruling elite, constructed with the same impressive ashlar masonry as the fortifications. Their walls are pierced by windows and doorways, and their roofs are tiled with terracotta, a material that is both durable and waterproof, essential in the wet winters when rain can last for days. The morning sun illuminates these structures, highlighting the fine workmanship of their construction. The corners are precisely aligned. The doorways are framed by carefully dressed stones, and here and there you can see evidence of decoration, carved moldings, painted plaster, perhaps even fragments of fresco work depicting geometric patterns or stylized floral motifs. This is not crude or primitive architecture, but the work of a society with resources, aesthetic ambitions, and access to skilled craftspeople who have learned their trades through long apprenticeship. Between the major buildings run narrow streets and alleys, some paved with flat stones, others simply packed earth. These thoroughfares are busy even in the early morning. Men and women move purposefully about their business, carrying jars of water from the citadel's wells, baskets of bread from the communal ovens, bundles of kindling for cooking fires. Children dart between the adults, playing games whose rules have been passed down through generations, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Dogs, lean and alert, patrol the edges of these spaces, looking for scraps and watching the human activity with intelligent eyes. The air within the citadel is thick with the smells of habitation. Wood smoke rises from numerous hearths, carrying with it the scent of cooking, bread baking, meat roasting, onions and garlic being fried in olive oil. Underlying these food smells are others, the acrid tang of urine from the dye works where textiles are being processed, the earthy smell of wet clay from a potter's workshop, the sharp scent of fresh-cut timber, the metallic smell of bronze being worked in a smithy. These are the smells of a functioning city, of human labor and craft, of the daily work that sustains communal life. You can hear the sounds as well, the rhythmic clang of a bronze smith's hammer, the scrape of stone on stone, as a woman grinds grain, the bleating of a goat being led to slaughter, the calls of vendors in the marketplace, the formal chanting of a priest performing morning rituals at a shrine, the creak of a wooden door, the splash of water being poured from a jar. Each sound is distinct, yet together they create a complex acoustic texture, the sound signature of a living community. From your vantage point within the citadel, you can see beyond the walls to the landscape below. The lower town sprawls across the slope and onto the plain, a dense cluster of buildings that covers an area many times larger than the citadel itself. Recent excavations have revealed that Bronze Age Troy was not just the fortified hilltop, but a much larger settlement, with the lower town enclosed by an extensive system of ditches and palisades. This is where most of Troy's population lives, not the elite in their stone palaces, but the farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, merchants and laborers whose work sustains the city's prosperity. The lower town is less architecturally impressive than the citadel, but no less important. Its buildings are constructed primarily of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with reeds from the river margins. The streets are unpaved, turning to mud in winter and dust in summer, lined with workshops, storehouses, and residential compounds where extended families live together in clusters of connected buildings around shared courtyards. This is where the pottery kilns smoke day and night during production seasons, where the textile workers labor at their looms, where the leather workers tan hides and the carpenters shape timber, where the daily life of Bronze Age Troy unfolds in all its ordinary essential detail. Beyond the lower town stretches the agricultural land that feeds the city, a patchwork of fields divided by low stone walls and irrigation ditches. Farmers are already at work in the early morning coolness, knowing that the midday heat will drive them to shelter. They are tending the crops that will be harvested in the coming weeks, the barley and wheat that will be threshed and winnowed and stored in the citadel's magazines, the surplus that will allow Troy to survive the winter and to trade for the goods it cannot produce itself. This is the economic base of the city's power, the agricultural labor that precedes and enables all the more specialized crafts and the commercial activities for which Troy is known throughout the region. To the west, visible from the citadel's ramparts, is the sea, a shimmer of blue on the horizon that represents both opportunity and threat. The sea brings trade and wealth, but it can also bring raiders and invaders, hostile ships appearing without warning on that blue horizon. The control of the approaches to the Dardanelles gives Troy much of its strategic importance, but that same control makes the city a target, a prize that ambitious rulers might seek to take for themselves. The fortifications you see around you are not merely for show but are maintained and improved generation after generation because the threat of violence, of sudden assault, is always present in the Bronze Age world. As you stand within the citadel, absorbing the sights and sounds and smells of this ancient city, you begin to understand that Troy is not a single thing, but a complex of many elements working together. The defensive walls, the administrative buildings, the religious shrines, the workshops and storehouses, the residential quarters, the lower town, the agricultural hinterland, the harbor, and the maritime trade routes. All of these elements are necessary, all are interconnected, and all depend on the continued functioning of the others. This is Troy as it truly was, a living city in the late Bronze Age, and it is here, in this place, that we will spend our time tonight, exploring its routines and rituals, its work and worship, its moments of peace and its times of crisis. The sun has fully risen now, and the citadel comes alive with the purposeful activity of a new day. Life in Troy is governed by routines that have been refined over generations, patterns of work and rest that reflect both the necessities of survival and the cultural values of the community. There is no single moment when the day begins, no factory whistle, no church bell, but rather a gradual awakening as individuals and families respond to the light and to the internal rhythms of their own bodies and needs. In the palace compound at the citadel's highest point, the royal household is stirring. The structure that archaeologists would later designate as Megaron VI is the largest and most impressive building in Troy, a columned hall built in the style common to many Bronze Age Aegean palaces. Its central room, the Megaron proper, is dominated by a large circular hearth in the floor, surrounded by 4 wooden columns that support the roof. The walls are plastered and painted, perhaps with frescoes depicting religious scenes or formalized representations of the natural world. Around this central hall are arranged smaller rooms, private chambers, storage areas, spaces for ritual and administration. The king, if we may call him that, though his actual title in the Luwian language spoken here is uncertain, rises in his private chamber. He is attended by servants who bring water for washing, heated in a bronze vessel over the night's banked coals. The water is poured into a large ceramic basin, and he performs his morning ablutions, a ritual of purification that is both practical and symbolic. The servants are silent and efficient, having performed these duties countless times before. They bring clean clothing, a long woolen tunic, finely woven, perhaps dyed with expensive purple or crimson, and a cloak fastened with an elaborate bronze pin. These garments are markers of status, as much political statements as they are protection against the elements. The king's morning meal is simple but carefully prepared. The bread is brought from the palace ovens, still warm, made from finely ground wheat flour, rather than the coarser barley that most of Troy's population eats. There is cheese, made from sheep's milk and aged in storage jars. There is honey, precious and expensive, collected from hives kept in the lower town. There are fresh figs, olives preserved in brine, perhaps a cup of wine diluted with water, according to the custom of the time. The meal is eaten not in solitude, but in the presence of his closest advisors and family members, for even this simple breakfast is a political occasion, a moment when counsel can be sought and given, when the day's business can be discussed in informal surroundings. The queen's routine is separate, but parallel. She too rises in her chambers, attended by her own servants, women who have served her family for years, and who know her preferences and requirements. Her clothing is as elaborate as the king's, her jewelry more extensive. She wears bronze and gold ornaments, rings, bracelets, pins, a necklace perhaps of amber beads imported from the distant Baltic, each piece chosen not just for beauty but for its value, and the statement it makes about her status and her family's wealth. Her morning may begin with prayers and offerings at a household shrine, a small space dedicated to the protective deities of the family, where figurines and cult objects are kept, and where she can make private supplications for the health of her children, the prosperity of the household, the favor of the gods. In the lower town, the day's beginning is less formal, but no less structured. Families wake in their timber-framed houses, sleeping quarters that are dark and crowded, beds of woven reeds or simple wooden frames covered with textiles and furs. The first task is always the same: to rekindle the hearth fire from the previous night's embers, adding dry kindling, and then larger pieces of wood until the flames catch and the cooking fire is ready. This fire is the literal center of the household, providing warmth, light, and the means to prepare food. It is tended primarily by women, a responsibility that is both practical and laden with symbolic meaning, for the hearth represents continuity, nourishment, and the stability of the family unit. Breakfast in the lower town is simple: bread, perhaps some cheese or olives, water or diluted wine. The food is eaten quickly, for there is work to be done. Men depart for their trades or for the fields, carrying tools and supplies. Some are farmers who will spend the day in the agricultural lands surrounding the city, tending crops or managing livestock. Others are craftspeople who work in the lower town's workshops, potters who will spend the day at their wheels, bronze smiths who will labor over their forges, carpenters who will shape timber into tools, furniture, and architectural elements. Still others are involved in the maritime economy, fishermen who will take their boats out onto the morning sea, sailors and merchants who will conduct business at the harbor, checking on ships, negotiating over cargoes, arranging for repairs or provisioning. Women's work is no less essential and often more varied. Some continue the work of textile production that occupies much of their time, spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving thread into cloth, dyeing cloth with expensive and labor-intensive colorants. Others prepare food, not just for immediate consumption but for preservation, drying fish and meat, preserving fruits and vegetables, making bread that will last for several days, churning butter, making cheese. Still others fetch water from the communal wells, a daily task that is necessary and time-consuming, involving multiple trips with heavy jars balanced on heads or shoulders or hips. The wells are also social spaces, places where women gather and exchange information, where the news of the day is discussed, where reputations are made and destroyed in the careful currencies of gossip and judgment. Children too have their roles in this economy. From an early age, they are incorporated into the world of adult labor, not as workers in the modern sense, but as learners, apprentices, who absorb the skills they will need as adults by watching and helping, and gradually taking on more responsibility. A boy might follow his father to the workshop or the fields, learning by observation and imitation how to shape bronze or to plow a furrow. A girl might sit beside her mother at the loom, learning the intricate patterns and techniques of weaving, or help in the kitchen, learning which herbs season which dishes, how to judge when bread is properly baked, how to preserve food against spoilage. The rhythm of the day is punctuated by ritual. At certain times, the sound of chanting or singing emerges from shrines scattered throughout the citadel and lower town as priests and priestesses perform the daily rites that maintain the favor of the gods. These are not elaborate public ceremonies but routine offerings, pouring libations of wine or oil, burning incense, speaking formulas of prayer and praise that have been handed down through generations. The gods are understood to be active participants in the life of the city, requiring constant attention and propitiation, and these daily rituals are the means by which that relationship is maintained. As the morning advances, the marketplace in the lower town becomes the center of commercial activity. This is not a permanent structure, but an open area where merchants and farmers spread their goods on mats or display them in baskets. Here you can find fresh produce from the surrounding farms, vegetables, fruits, eggs. Here are the products of the city's craftspeople, pottery in a variety of forms and qualities, textiles from simple linen to elaborately decorated wool, tools and weapons of bronze, jewelry of precious and semi-precious materials. The marketplace is a place of negotiation and exchange, where prices are discussed and bargained over, where news is shared, where the social fabric of the community is woven and rewoven through thousands of small interactions. Trade is conducted primarily through barter, the direct exchange of goods, though there is also a system of standardized weights that allows for more abstract calculations of value. Metal, particularly bronze, serves as a kind of currency, its value widely recognized and relatively stable. Small pieces of bronze weighed on balance scales can be exchanged for goods, though most transactions involve the direct trading of commodities: a jar of oil for a measure of grain, a length of cloth for a bronze knife, a basket of fish for a pair of sandals. The system is flexible and personal, depending on individual relationships, on reputation, on the perceived fairness of the exchange. The day's work continues through the hot hours of mid-afternoon. In the workshops, the rhythm of labor is steady and practiced. The potter's wheel spins continuously, shaped by skilled hands into vessels of remarkable uniformity. The bronze smith's hammer rises and falls in a measured cadence, shaping heated metal on an anvil. The carpenter's saw and adze cut and shape timber, creating joints that will hold without nails, relying on careful measurement and traditional techniques passed down through generations. This is skilled labor, work that requires years to master, and the products of this labor are the material foundation of Troy's prosperity. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, the pace of work gradually slows, tools are cleaned and stored, workspaces are swept and tidied, fires are banked for the night or allowed to die down. People begin to return to their homes, to their families, to the evening meal that will mark the transition from the public world of work to the more private world of the household. This meal is often the day's main event, a time when the family gathers, when the day's experiences are shared, when bonds are reinforced through the simple act of eating together. The evening meal in a lower town household might consist of a thick stew made from barley or lentils, flavored with onions and herbs, perhaps with some meat or fish if the family is prosperous, or if the day's hunting or fishing was successful. There is bread, of course, always bread, the staple that appears at every meal. There might be cheese, olives, fresh or dried fruit. Wine is drunk, diluted with water, a practice that is both cultural and practical, for wine is safer to drink than water that might be contaminated, and the dilution makes the wine supply last longer. As darkness falls, the city gradually quiets. Without artificial lighting, there is little productive work that can be done after sunset. Oil lamps, small ceramic vessels with a wick floating in olive oil, provide a weak flickering light sufficient for minimal tasks but hardly adequate for detailed work. Most families bank their fires and retire to their sleeping quarters, seeking rest after the day's labor. The streets empty, though they are not entirely deserted. There are always those whose duties require them to be abroad at night. watchmen on the citadel walls, priests attending to nighttime rituals, occasionally a messenger arriving with urgent news from distant places. From the citadel ramparts, a watchman looks out over the darkened plain and the dim lights of the lower town. The stars are brilliant in the unpolluted sky, their patterns familiar and meaningful, used for navigation and for tracking the passage of seasons. The sea beyond is invisible in the darkness, a vast presence felt rather than seen. All is quiet, or as quiet as any human settlement ever is, the silence broken occasionally by a dog's bark, a child's cry, the murmur of voices from a lighted doorway. This is Troy at rest, gathering its strength for the next day, its routines and rhythms continuing as they have for generations, as they will, the inhabitants believe, for generations to come. The people of Troy do not form a homogeneous mass but are stratified into distinct social classes, each with its own roles, responsibilities and prerogatives. Understanding these divisions is essential to understanding how the city functions, how power is distributed and exercised, how resources are allocated and controlled. The society of Bronze Age Troy is hierarchical, as are virtually all complex societies of the period, but it is not rigid or inflexible. There are mechanisms for mobility, for the accumulation or loss of status, though these operate within carefully defined limits. At the apex of Troy's social pyramid stands the ruling family, the king and queen and their closest relatives. These are the individuals who inhabit the great megaron at the citadel's summit, who wear the most elaborate jewelry, who eat the finest food, who are attended by numerous servants and retainers. Their authority is not absolute in the manner of later empires. There is no evidence that Troy's kings wielded the godlike power of Egyptian pharaohs or the vast bureaucratic control of Hittite emperors. Rather, their power is based on a combination of factors: ownership of the most productive land, control of trade and harbor revenues, command of military forces, and possession of the religious authority that comes from serving as intermediary between the human community and the divine realm. The king's day is filled with the business of governance. He receives delegations from the surrounding territories that acknowledge Troy's overlordship, villages and farmsteads that pay tribute in the form of grain, livestock, or labor services. He hears disputes brought for judgment, cases that cannot be resolved at lower levels of authority, disagreements over property boundaries, accusations of theft or assault, conflicts between powerful families that threaten to disrupt the community's peace. His judgments are not arbitrary, but are expected to reflect established customs and precedents, the traditional law that has accumulated over generations and that is preserved in the memories of elders and legal specialists. He also manages Troy's external relationships. Messengers arrive from distant courts, from the Hittite capital at Hattusa, from Mycenaean kingdoms across the sea, perhaps from the coastal cities of the Levant or from the inland kingdoms of Anatolia. These messengers carry tablets inscribed in cuneiform script, the international diplomatic language of the age, written in Akkadian or Hittite. The tablets contain letters from fellow rulers, sometimes addressing the king of Troy as brother, offering greetings, discussing matters of trade or diplomacy, requesting assistance or promising aid, occasionally complaining about violations of treaties or the mistreatment of merchants. The king must formulate appropriate responses, consulting with his advisors, carefully weighing the implications of his words, for these diplomatic relationships are delicate and can easily be damaged by perceived slights or failures of protocol. The queen's role is distinct from but complementary to the king's. She manages the palace household, a complex enterprise involving dozens or even hundreds of individuals, servants, craftspeople, slaves. She oversees the production of textiles, a major component of Bronze Age wealth, supervising the women who spin and weave and dye cloth. She organizes religious ceremonies, particularly those associated with female deities or with domestic and agricultural fertility. She may serve as regent in the king's absence, exercising authority in her own right, though the exact extent of her independent power is difficult to determine from the archaeological record alone. Below the royal family but still within the elite ranks are the aristocratic families of the citadel, the men who own substantial properties, who command retinues of their own followers, who serve as the king's military commanders and administrative officials. These are families with pedigrees stretching back generations, whose ancestors are remembered in oral traditions, whose tombs are marked with monuments. Their wealth comes primarily from land, from estates in the agricultural territories surrounding Troy, worked by dependent laborers or tenant farmers who owe them portions of the harvest. but they also participate in trade, financing or directly engaging in commercial ventures, and they may own workshops in the lower town where craftspeople produce goods for local use and export. These aristocratic men form the King's Council, an advisory body that meets regularly to discuss matters of importance to the city-state. They are not merely yes-men, but have their own interests and opinions, and the king must navigate carefully among competing factions and viewpoints. Important decisions, whether to go to war, how to respond to threats, how to allocate resources during times of shortage, are not made unilaterally, but emerge from consensus within this council. A king who consistently ignores the advice of his aristocratic peers risks losing their support, and without that support, his authority becomes hollow and vulnerable to challenge. The military class overlaps substantially with the aristocracy, for warfare in the Bronze Age is largely the province of the elite. The core of Troy's military force consists of aristocratic warriors, men who can afford the expensive equipment required for Bronze Age combat: bronze armor, helmets, spears, swords, shields. These men train from childhood in the martial arts, learning to fight on foot and possibly from chariots, mastering the use of weapons, developing the physical strength and endurance that combat demands. They conceive of warfare not merely as a necessity, but as an arena for the demonstration of personal courage and the accumulation of honor, concepts that are central to aristocratic identity. But Troy's military forces are not composed solely of elite warriors. There are also the common soldiers, men drawn from the broader population, equipped with simpler weapons, spears, slings, bows, and provided with minimal armor or none at all. These men fight not for personal glory, but out of obligation to their lords or to the city itself. They are less individually skilled than the aristocratic warriors, but can be effective in mass formations, and they perform the unglamorous but essential military tasks: garrison duty on the walls, patrol of the territory, labor on fortifications and military infrastructure. Below the aristocracy are the free craftspeople and merchants of the lower town, individuals who own their own workshops or their own trading vessels, who participate in the market economy, who possess skills that give them economic independence and a degree of social respect. These are the potters and smiths, the carpenters and leather workers, the weavers and dyers, the ship captains and merchants who travel to distant ports. They are not wealthy by aristocratic standards, but neither are they poor. They can afford to own their own homes, to provide adequately for their families, to save against hard times. Some have dependent laborers working for them, apprentices learning the trade or hired workers paid in food and modest wages. The merchant class is particularly important in Troy given the city's role in maritime trade. These are men who understand the complexities of long-distance commerce, who know the value of goods in different markets, who can negotiate in multiple languages, who have contacts in ports throughout the Aegean and beyond. They travel regularly, sometimes for months at a time, sailing to Cyprus for copper, to Crete for luxury goods, to the Levantine coast for purple dye and cedar wood, to the Mycenaean kingdoms for pottery and finished goods. They return with cargoes that are sold in Troy's market or transshipped to other destinations, and their profits, though modest by modern standards, accumulate over time into substantial wealth. The largest segment of Troy's population consists of farmers, laborers, and dependent workers, people who own little or no property, who work for others in exchange for subsistence and protection. These are the men and women who till the fields surrounding the city, who tend the livestock, who harvest the crops, who perform the countless tasks of agricultural labor that make possible all the more specialized activities of urban life. Their lives are hard and precarious, vulnerable to crop failures, to disease, to the demands of their overlords. Yet they are not slaves, not entirely without rights or agency. They can own small personal property, can sometimes accumulate modest savings, and in times of need can appeal to customary protections and to the king's justice. At the bottom of the social hierarchy are the slaves, individuals who are owned as property, who can be bought and sold, who have no legal rights, and are entirely dependent on the will of their owners. Slavery in the Bronze Age is not always the racialized hereditary institution that it would become in later periods. Many slaves are war captives, people taken during raids or conquests and brought back to Troy to serve in households or to work in workshops. Others may have been enslaved due to debt, unable to repay loans and forced to work off what they owe through their labor. Still others are born into slavery, children of slave mothers who inherit their mother's status. The treatment of slaves varies widely depending on the character of the owner and the nature of the work, ranging from relatively mild domestic service to harsh labor in mines or on large agricultural estates. Women occupy a complex position in this hierarchical society. Their status depends heavily on their class and family connections. Elite women, like the queen and the wives and daughters of aristocrats, can possess considerable power and wealth, managing households, owning property, participating in religious rituals, and occasionally wielding political influence. Women of the middle classes work alongside their husbands in family enterprises, contributing essential labor to workshops and farms, and often managing household finances. Lower-class women perform agricultural labor, textile work and domestic service, their lives shaped by constant physical toil and limited opportunities for advancement. Children are valued, but their lives are not sentimentalized as in modern cultures. Infant mortality is high. Perhaps 1 child in 3 does not survive to adulthood, and parents must maintain an emotional distance from newborns until it becomes clear the child will survive. Once past the dangerous early years, children are incorporated into the productive life of the community, learning through observation and participation the skills they will need as adults. Childhood is not a separate protected realm but a period of apprenticeship and preparation. The social fabric of Troy is thus woven from many different threads: kings and commoners, warriors and farmers, merchants and slaves, men and women, old and young. Each group has its place, its role, its expectations and obligations. The system is not equal or democratic, but it is functional, providing the organization and stability necessary for a complex urban society to survive and prosper in the challenging environment of the Bronze Age world. The harbor is Troy's window to the wider world, the point of contact between the isolated citadel on its hilltop and the vast maritime networks that stretch across the Mediterranean and beyond. Here on the beaches and in the protected anchorages near the mouth of the Scamander River, the evidence of Troy's international connections is most visible and most dramatic. On any given day during the sailing season, which runs from spring to autumn, the harbor is crowded with vessels from distant ports, each with its own cargo, its own crew, its own story. You walk down from the citadel in the early morning, following the road that descends through the lower town and out onto the plain. The air is already warming, and you can taste the salt on the wind that blows steadily from the west. As you approach the harbor area, the pace of activity increases. Workers are moving purposefully, carrying goods on their backs or shoulders, rolling large storage jars on their edges, leading pack animals laden with supplies. The sound of voices rises, men calling to each other in Greek, in Luwian, in languages you cannot identify, the polyglot babble of an international port. The ships themselves are remarkable objects, representing the cutting edge of Bronze Age technology and craftsmanship. They are not large by later standards, perhaps 15 to 20 meters in length, capable of carrying a few tons of cargo, but they are sophisticated and seaworthy, capable of voyaging hundreds of miles across open water. The basic design is a long, narrow hull, built primarily for speed and maneuverability, with both ends curving upward to keep waves from swamping the deck. The hull is constructed by the shell-first method, planks joined edge to edge with mortise and tenon joints, then reinforced with internal frames. The wood is primarily pine or cedar, chosen for its workability and its resistance to rot. The seams between planks are caulked with resin mixed with fiber to keep the hull watertight. Most of these vessels have a single mast amidships, carrying a large square sail woven from linen or wool. The sail is the primary means of propulsion when the wind is favorable, but all of these ships also carry oars, allowing them to maneuver in confined waters or to make progress when the wind is contrary. The oars are manned by the crew, typically a dozen to 20 men depending on the size of the vessel, each pulling in rhythm to a chant or drumbeat. These are not slave galleys. The rowers are free men, professional sailors who understand their craft, who know how to read wind and weather, who can navigate by the stars and by the landmarks of familiar coasts. The cargoes these ships carry are varied and valuable. You see large ceramic jars, known to later archaeologists as pithoi, used for transporting wine and olive oil. Each jar is sealed with a clay stopper and marked with symbols indicating its contents and origin. There are ingots of copper, shaped like oxides for ease of handling and stacking, each weighing about 30 kilograms. Copper is the primary component of bronze, and its trade is essential to the Bronze Age economy. Troy itself has no copper mines, so all the metal used here must be imported, primarily from Cyprus, the ancient world's greatest source of this vital commodity. There are also tin ingots, smaller and more valuable than copper, for tin is rarer and comes from more distant and uncertain sources. Without tin, copper cannot be alloyed into bronze, so the tin trade, though less visible in the archaeological record, is equally critical. The origin of Bronze Age tin is one of the enduring mysteries of ancient trade, with possible sources including Afghanistan, Central Asia, and perhaps even distant Cornwall in Britain, though the routes by which it reached the Mediterranean are complex and poorly understood. Other cargoes are more exotic and luxurious. There are bales of textiles, fine wool dyed with expensive colorants, purple from murex shells, red from madder root, yellow from saffron. There are jars of precious oils and unguents, perfumes and cosmetics that will be used by Troy's elite. There are ivory tusks from Africa or Syria, destined to be carved into decorative objects. There are semi-precious stones, carnelian, lapis lazuli, amber, that will be fashioned into jewelry. There are sealed jars of spices and condiments, flavors from distant lands that command high prices in Troy's marketplace. The process of loading and unloading is labor-intensive and requires careful coordination. The ships cannot dock at a pier. There are no permanent harbor structures, just the natural beach and the river's edge. Instead, the vessels are run up onto the sand at high tide, then unloaded before the tide recedes. Alternatively, they anchor in slightly deeper water, and their cargoes are ferried ashore in smaller boats or carried on the shoulders of workers who wade out through the surf. Each method has its advantages and risks, and the ship's captain must make constant calculations about tide, weather, and the value and fragility of the cargo. Harbor officials, appointed by the king and responsible to him, oversee all this activity. They keep records, inscribed on clay tablets or perhaps on perishable materials like parchment, that have not survived, documenting which ships have arrived, what cargoes they carry, what fees are owed. The fees themselves are a major source of revenue for Troy. Anchorage fees, fees for use of the harbor facilities such as they are, fees for protection from pirates, fees for access to the city's market, fees for storage in the warehouses of the lower town. These fees are negotiable, subject to haggling, and to the relationships between the ship's owners and Troy's authorities, but they are also inescapable. No ship trades at Troy without paying, and the king's officials have the military force necessary to compel compliance. The harbor is also a point of cultural exchange, a place where ideas and information flow as freely as goods. Sailors bring news from distant ports, which cities are prospering, which are at war, which trade routes are currently safe, which are plagued by pirates or political instability. They bring stories, rumors, gossip about the doings of foreign courts, about natural disasters, about military victories and defeats. They bring new styles in pottery and jewelry, new techniques in crafts, new words and phrases that enter the local language. The harbor is cosmopolitan in a way that the citadel and the lower town are not, a zone where Troy connects to the larger world. Not all the ships are merchant vessels. Occasionally, a larger, more heavily built craft arrives, a warship carrying warriors and representatives from one of the great powers. These are diplomatic missions, and their arrival necessitates careful protocol. The ship's captain sends a messenger ahead to the citadel, requesting permission to land and announcing the identity and purpose of the delegation. The king's officials arrange appropriate accommodations, prepare formal receptions, organize the gift exchanges that are essential to diplomatic relations. These gifts are not mere gestures but carefully calculated demonstrations of wealth and power, elaborate textiles, precious metal objects, exotic imports, sometimes even human slaves or prized animals. The gifts must be appropriate to the status of both giver and receiver, neither so lavish as to suggest weakness, nor so modest as to give offense. Trade at Troy is not conducted solely by foreign merchants. Troy's own residents, both elite and common, participate actively in commercial ventures. Some wealthy families own trading vessels, financing expeditions to distant ports and taking a share of the profits. Others provide capital for trade missions, lending money or goods to merchants who will repay with interest or with a portion of the cargoes they acquire. The risks are substantial. Ships can sink in storms, be captured by pirates, or simply fail to find profitable markets for their goods. But so are the potential rewards, and the willingness to take these risks is part of what makes Troy prosperous. The sailing season does not last year-round. From late autumn through early spring, the weather becomes too unpredictable and dangerous for routine maritime travel. Storms are frequent and severe, winds are variable and unreliable, and the short daylight hours make navigation more difficult. During these months, the harbor is nearly empty, with only local fishing boats venturing out onto the water. The foreign merchants who have made their way to Troy before the season closes either depart hurriedly for home or settle in for the winter, finding accommodation in the lower town, waiting for spring when the seas will be safe again. This seasonal rhythm has significant economic implications. The goods that arrive during the sailing season must be stored and distributed throughout the year. Troy's warehouses are essential infrastructure, large structures capable of holding the surplus that will sustain the city through the winter and provide goods for trade when the ships return in spring. The management of these stores is a sophisticated enterprise, requiring record-keeping, pest control, security, and careful monitoring of quantities and quality. Grain can spoil if stored improperly, oil can go rancid, wine can turn to vinegar, metal can corrode, textiles can be damaged by moisture or eaten by insects. The officials responsible for these warehouses have important and demanding roles, and their success or failure can have significant consequences for Troy's prosperity and stability. As you stand on the beach, watching the ships and the bustling activity of the harbor, you begin to understand how fundamental this place is to Troy's identity and survival. The city's wealth does not come primarily from the agricultural plane, though that is important. It does not come from manufacturing or from mineral resources, though these contribute. It comes from Troy's position astride the maritime routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea, from its ability to extract fees and tolls from passing traffic, from its role as a transshipment point and a market where goods from different regions can be exchanged. The harbor is where all of this happens, where the abstract concepts of trade and wealth become concrete in the form of actual ships, actual cargoes, actual transactions. Without this harbor, Troy would be just another fortified hill town in Anatolia. With it, Troy is a power, a city whose influence extends far beyond its walls. Religion permeates every aspect of life in Bronze Age Troy. It is not a separate sphere of existence, something practiced on special occasions or in designated sacred spaces, but rather a constant presence, shaping daily routines, informing political decisions, providing explanations for natural phenomena and human experiences. To understand Troy, you must understand its religious life, the gods and goddesses who are believed to influence events, the rituals and offerings that maintain proper relations with the divine, the specialists who mediate between human and supernatural realms. The gods of Troy are not distant, abstract entities, but are understood as active participants in the world, possessing personalities, preferences, and the capacity to intervene directly in human affairs. They are powerful but not omnipotent, immortal but not unchangeable, and they require constant attention and propitiation from their human worshippers. The relationship between gods and humans is conceived along the lines of patron-client relationships, or even as paralleling the relationships between rulers and subjects. Humans owe the gods respect, obedience, and offerings. In return, the gods provide protection, prosperity, and favor. The specific identities of Troy's gods are difficult to determine with certainty, for we have no written religious texts from the city itself, no myths recorded in the local language, no comprehensive theological treatises. We must infer religious beliefs from material remains, from the layout of sanctuaries, from the types of offerings left at shrines, from the iconography of religious art, from comparisons with better documented neighboring cultures. The city's position in the Anatolian cultural sphere suggests that its religious life shared much with the Hittite and Luwian traditions, while its connections to the Aegean world may have introduced elements from Minoan and Mycenaean religion as well. You enter one of the citadel's major sanctuaries in the early morning, joining a small group of worshippers who have come to make offerings and to seek the favor of the deity honored here. The sanctuary is not a large building like a later Greek temple, but rather a complex of structures and open spaces arranged around a central altar. The altar itself is a raised platform of stones, blackened by centuries of burnt offerings, its surface still warm from yesterday's sacrifices. Around the altar are various installations, libation pits where liquid offerings are poured into the ground, platforms where cult statues or sacred objects are displayed, stone benches where worshippers can sit or kneel during ceremonies. The cult statue, if we may call it that, is not a realistic representation, but a stylized figure, perhaps carved from wood and adorned with textiles and jewelry, perhaps fashioned from precious metal, its face painted, its eyes perhaps inlaid with stone or shell to give it a lifelike appearance. This is not merely a symbol of the deity, but is understood to be animated by divine presence, a physical locus where the god or goddess can be addressed, can receive offerings, can communicate through signs and omens. The statue is treated with the utmost reverence, clothed in fine garments, regularly cleaned and anointed with oil, offered food and drink as though it were a living being. The priest who oversees this sanctuary emerges from an inner chamber, dressed in ritual garments that mark his special status. He is a specialist, a man who has been trained in the complex traditions of worship, who knows the proper prayers and formulas, who understands the calendar of religious festivals, who can interpret omens and perform divination. His position is not necessarily hereditary, though religious offices often run in families, but depends on training, aptitude, and the approval of the religious community and the political authorities who support the sanctuary. The morning ritual begins with purification. The priest pours water from a bronze ewer into a basin, washing his hands in a prescribed manner, speaking words of purification under his breath. Then he approaches the altar and begins to prepare the offering. A sheep has been brought by a worshipper, a substantial gift that represents significant expense. The animal must be without blemish, free of disease or deformity, an offering worthy of the god. The priest inspects it carefully, then leads it to the altar. A prayer is spoken, a formulaic address to the deity, stating the worshipper's name and lineage, the reason for the offering, the favor being sought, perhaps the health of a child, or success in a trading venture, or protection against enemies. The sacrifice itself is performed with a bronze knife, a swift cut to the throat that kills the animal quickly. The blood is caught in a bowl and poured onto the altar or into a libation pit, returning the animal's life force to the earth and to the deity. Then the carcass is butchered, certain portions, the thigh bones, wrapped in fat. The internal organs are designated as the god's share and are burned on the altar, the smoke rising to the sky, carrying the offering upward. The rest of the meat will be distributed, some to the priest as his payment, some returned to the worshipper for a sacred feast, some perhaps distributed to the community as a form of social welfare. The sacrifice is accompanied by prayers and hymns, formulaic words and phrases that have been passed down through generations, perhaps even preserved in written form on clay tablets in an archive we have not yet discovered. The language is elevated and archaic, different from everyday speech, lending the ritual a sense of timeless authority and connection to the ancestors who first established these traditions. The worshippers participate by responding at certain points, by making gestures of reverence, by maintaining an attitude of respect and concentration throughout the ceremony. Not all religious activity involves sacrifice. There are also offerings of a simpler kind, libations of wine or oil poured onto altars or into special pits, deposits of food or valuable objects, dedications of votive figurines or other symbolic items. These offerings are accessible to people of modest means, allowing even the poor to participate in religious life and to seek divine favor. The accumulation of such offerings over time creates sacred deposits, layers of material that archaeologists would later discover, providing evidence of continuous religious activity at particular locations. Religious festivals punctuate the agricultural year, marking significant points in the cycle of planting and harvest. These festivals are both religious and social occasions, bringing the community together in collective worship, feasting, and celebration. A harvest festival in late summer, for example, might involve processions through the city, carrying representations of the gods or symbols of agricultural abundance, accompanied by music and singing. There would be communal sacrifices on a much larger scale than daily offerings, perhaps dozens of animals slaughtered and their meat distributed to the entire population. There would be athletic competitions, displays of martial skill, performances of music and dance. These festivals serve multiple functions. They honor the gods, they reinforce community bonds, they provide entertainment and a break from routine labor, and they demonstrate the generosity and piety of the city's rulers who sponsor them. Divination is another important aspect of religious life. The future is understood to be knowable, at least partially, through the proper reading of signs sent by the gods. There are numerous methods of divination practiced in Troy. The most prestigious involves the examination of sacrificial animals' internal organs, particularly the liver, whose shape and markings are believed to reveal divine intentions. A skilled diviner, trained in the complex interpretation of these signs, can read the liver and provide guidance on important decisions, whether to go to war, whether to undertake a trading voyage, whether a proposed marriage is auspicious, whether a planned construction project will succeed. Other forms of divination are more accessible. The flight patterns of birds are observed and interpreted, different species and behaviors having different meanings. Dreams are considered significant, especially if they are vivid or recurring, and there are specialists who interpret dreams, relating the images and events to waking life concerns. Unusual natural phenomena, earthquakes, eclipses, comets, deformed births, are all read as omens, signs that the gods are communicating displeasure or providing warnings about future events. The interpretation of these signs is not arbitrary, but follows traditional rules and precedents, though there is always room for debate and disagreement among interpreters. Women play significant roles in Troy's religious life, perhaps more prominent than in some other spheres of Bronze Age society. There are priestesses who serve specific deities, particularly goddesses associated with fertility, childbirth, and domestic prosperity. These priestesses may live in the sanctuary, dedicating their lives to religious service, or they may be married women who perform ritual duties in addition to their family responsibilities. Some female religious specialists are diviners or healers, using a combination of practical knowledge and ritual means to treat illness and injury. The connection between women and certain aspects of religious life is partly rooted in the association of female deities with fundamental life processes, birth, nourishment, growth, but it also reflects women's important economic roles, particularly in textile production, which often has ritual dimensions. The landscape around Troy is dotted with sacred sites beyond the main sanctuaries of the citadel. There are springs believed to be inhabited by spirits or minor deities, where people leave small offerings and draw water for ritual purification. There are groves of ancient trees considered sacred, where no wood may be cut without risking divine anger. There are caves and rock formations associated with myths or with supernatural occurrences, places of power where the boundary between the human and divine worlds is thought to be especially thin. These sites are integrated into the community's mental map of the landscape, and they are visited at appropriate times for specific purposes, to swear oaths, to seek healing, to perform private devotions away from the public rituals of the citadel. The dead, too, are part of the religious landscape, though not in the sense of ancestor worship, as practiced in some cultures. The dead are buried with care, often with grave goods that will be useful or comforting in whatever afterlife is envisioned. The graves are located outside the inhabited areas, in cemeteries that grow over generations, marking the presence of the past alongside the living present. There are periodic ceremonies honoring the dead, occasions when offerings are made at graves, when the names of ancestors are recited, when the living community reaffirms its connections to those who came before. The dead are not forgotten, but neither are they constantly present in daily life. They occupy their own realm, separate from but adjacent to the world of the living. Religion in Troy is thus not a single unified system, but a complex of practices, beliefs, and institutions that address different needs and concerns. It provides explanation and meaning, offering answers to the fundamental questions of existence. Where do we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens after death? How should we live? What forces control our fate? It provides social cohesion, creating shared identities and common purposes through collective rituals and festivals. It provides legitimation for political authority, for the king rules not just through force or wealth, but as an intermediary between the human community and the divine powers who ultimately determine all things. And it provides comfort and hope, the reassurance that there are powers greater than ourselves who can be appealed to, who might intervene on our behalf, who care about the fate of individuals and communities. This is the spiritual dimension of life in Bronze Age Troy, as real and as necessary to its inhabitants as the food they eat, the air they breathe, the walls that protect them. The military life of Troy is inseparable from the city's identity and its survival. In the Bronze Age world, violence is a constant threat, and the ability to defend oneself, to project force when necessary, and to deter potential aggressors through displays of military strength is essential for any community that wishes to remain independent and prosperous. Troy's wealth and strategic position make it both a target for others and a participant in the military conflicts that periodically sweep across the region. Understanding the city's military organization, its warriors, its tactics and strategies, is crucial to understanding how Troy has managed to survive and thrive for so many generations. The citadel's massive fortifications are the most visible manifestation of Troy's military concerns. These walls are not merely defensive structures, but are carefully designed killing grounds, engineered to maximize the advantage of the defenders, and to make any assault as costly and difficult as possible. The walls are high enough that they cannot easily be scaled with ladders, thick enough that they cannot easily be breached by ramming, and built in a circuit that eliminates blind spots where attackers might gather unobserved. The towers that project from the walls allow defenders to direct fire along the wall's length, catching attackers in crossfire, and the narrow, angled gates force any assault to slow and compress, creating bottlenecks where superior numbers become less effective. The men who defend these walls are not a professional standing army in the modern sense, but rather a militia drawn from the citizen population, supplemented by a corps of aristocratic warriors who train regularly and who possess the best equipment. Every able-bodied man in Troy is expected to contribute to the city's defense when necessary, whether by manning the walls, by serving in patrols, or by laboring on the maintenance and improvement of fortifications. This is a civic obligation, part of what it means to be a member of the community, and shirking this duty brings social shame and potentially legal penalties. Training for warfare begins in childhood, at least for the aristocratic class from which Troy's military leaders are drawn. Young boys are taught to use weapons, first wooden practice swords and spears, later actual bronze implements. They learn the basic stances and movements of combat, the footwork that allows a warrior to maintain balance while striking or defending, the techniques for using a shield effectively, the proper way to throw a spear or to thrust with a sword. As they grow older, the training becomes more intensive and more realistic, involving sparring with peers, mock combat, using blunted weapons, and eventually supervised participation in actual military actions, raids on neighboring territories, patrols along the frontier, responses to threats. The weapons themselves are objects of significant value and craftsmanship. A bronze sword is not a simple object, but the product of sophisticated metallurgy and skilled manufacturing. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, typically in a ratio of about 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, heated to high temperature and cast in molds, then worked and finished to create a sharp, durable blade. The sword must be properly balanced, its weight distributed so that it can be wielded effectively, its edge maintained through regular sharpening. A well-made bronze sword is both a tool and a work of art, often decorated with incised patterns or inlaid with precious metals personalized for its owner. Spears are perhaps even more important than swords in Bronze Age warfare. They are cheaper to produce, require less metal, and are effective both as thrusting weapons in close combat and as projectiles that can be thrown at approaching enemies. A warrior typically carries multiple spears, throwing one or two as the enemy closes, then using another for hand-to-hand combat. The spear shafts are made from straight-grained wood, carefully selected and seasoned, with bronze spearheads socketed onto the shaft and secured with bindings. The shape and weight of the spearhead varies depending on its intended use. Light throwing spears have smaller, more streamlined heads, while thrusting spears have larger, more robust heads capable of penetrating armor. Defensive equipment is equally important. The shield is a warrior's primary defense, typically round or figure-eight shaped, constructed from a wooden frame covered with layers of leather. The center has a bronze boss, and the rim may be reinforced with bronze as well. The shield is held by a central grip or by arm straps, and a skilled warrior can use it not just to passively block attacks, but to actively parry, to push and shove, to create openings for his own strikes. Body armor, when it is worn, consists of bronze plates or scales attached to a leather or textile backing, protecting the torso while allowing reasonable mobility. Helmets are made of bronze, shaped to deflect blows and to protect the head and face, though the protection comes at the cost of reduced visibility and hearing. Not all warriors can afford such elaborate equipment. The common soldiers, drawn from the lower classes, fight with simpler gear, perhaps a spear and a small shield, a helmet if they are fortunate, but often no body armor at all. They are more vulnerable in combat but also more numerous, and in certain tactical situations, mass infantry formations of spear-armed soldiers can be highly effective. The aristocratic warriors with their superior equipment and training are shock troops, capable of breaking enemy formations or of holding key positions, but they cannot win battles alone without the support of the common soldiers. Troy's military strategy is primarily defensive. The city's wealth and power come from trade, not from territorial conquest, and the goal is to maintain security and stability, not to embark on campaigns of expansion. The fortifications are designed to withstand sieges, to allow the population to survive extended periods of blockade by storing adequate food and water within the citadel and the lower town. The location on a hill provides observation of the surrounding territory, allowing early warning of approaching threats, and the system of alliances and treaties with neighboring powers provides a degree of diplomatic protection, making potential attackers consider whether the benefits of conquering Troy are worth the costs and the risk of retaliation from Troy's allies. But defense does not mean passivity. Troy maintains military forces capable of offensive action when necessary. Raiding is a common feature of Bronze Age warfare, and Troy both suffers from raids and conducts them against others. A raid is not a pitched battle, but a swift strike against enemy territory, aimed at capturing livestock, seizing plunder, destroying crops, or taking prisoners who can be enslaved or ransomed. Raids serve multiple purposes. They weaken enemies, they demonstrate martial prowess and accumulate prestige for successful warriors, and they can be a form of retaliation or of enforcing compliance with treaties and obligations. Naval power is also part of Troy's military capabilities, though we know less about Bronze Age naval warfare than about land combat. The city's control of the approaches to the Dardanelles requires the ability to operate at sea, to protect friendly shipping, and to interdict hostile vessels. The same ships that carry trade can be adapted for military purposes, outfitted with warriors who can board enemy vessels or who can make amphibious assaults on coastal targets. Naval warfare in this period is not about ship-to-ship combat, but about the transport and delivery of fighters, about controlling access to harbors and anchorages, about protecting or disrupting maritime trade. The psychological dimension of military life is significant. Warfare is terrifying. The prospect of violent death, of serious injury, of seeing friends and comrades killed or maimed. The culture of Troy, like most warrior cultures, develops mechanisms to manage this fear and to motivate men to fight despite it. Concepts of honor and shame are paramount. A man who fights bravely, who stands his ground, who protects his comrades, earns respect and prestige that translate into social status and material rewards. A man who flees, who shows cowardice, brings shame not just on himself but on his family, and this shame can be devastating, more frightening than the physical dangers of combat. Religion also plays a role in military motivation and morale. Warriors make offerings before battle, seeking divine favor and protection. They carry amulets and talismans believed to have protective powers. They believe that their fates are in the hands of the gods, that survival or death is determined by forces beyond their control, and this belief can be oddly comforting, removing some of the burden of anxiety about outcomes. After battle, there are rituals of purification and thanksgiving, ceremonies to honor the dead and to restore the warriors to the peacetime community. The training and maintenance of military forces is expensive, consuming resources that might otherwise be used for productive purposes. Bronze weapons and armor are costly. Training takes time away from agricultural or craft labor. Maintaining fortifications requires ongoing investment in materials and labor, yet these costs are accepted as necessary, for without military power, Troy's wealth would make it a target that could not defend itself, and the city would be conquered, its people killed or enslaved, its accumulated prosperity seized by others. The military dimension of life in Troy is not an aberration or a distraction from civilian concerns, but is integral to the city's existence, a constant undercurrent that shapes decisions, allocates resources, and defines what it means to be a member of this community. The artistic and cultural life of Troy is less dramatic than its military exploits or its commercial successes, but it is no less important in defining the character of the city and the quality of life its inhabitants experience. Art in the Bronze Age is not primarily about individual creative expression or aesthetic experimentation, as it would become in later periods, but is functional and communal, serving practical purposes, reinforcing social values, and creating the physical and symbolic environment in which people live. Pottery is perhaps the most ubiquitous art form. for ceramic vessels are essential to daily life, used for cooking, storage, eating, drinking, and ritual. Troy's potters work in workshops in the lower town, using wheels to shape clay into forms that are both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The clay is sourced from local deposits, prepared by removing impurities and adding temper to prevent cracking during firing, then shaped on the wheel by skilled hands that can create vessels of remarkable uniformity. After shaping, the vessels are allowed to dry partially, then decorated before firing. The decoration of pottery reflects both local traditions and international influences. Some vessels are left plain, their beauty coming from the purity of their forms and the quality of their surfaces. Others are decorated with incised patterns, geometric designs of lines, triangles and circles scratched into the clay before firing. Still others are painted, using slips of refined clay that fire to different colors, creating contrasts and patterns. The designs are typically abstract or stylized rather than representational, though occasionally you might see schematic depictions of humans or animals. The painted pottery shows influences from the Aegean world, particularly from Mycenaean Greece, whose distinctive pottery styles are imported to Troy and sometimes imitated by local craftspeople. Textile production is another major art form, and one in which women play the dominant role. The process of creating textiles is long and labor-intensive, beginning with the shearing of sheep or the harvesting of flax, continuing through the cleaning and preparation of fibers, the spinning of thread, the weaving of cloth, and often the dyeing and finishing of the final product. Each stage requires skill and knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter through generations. Weaving is performed on vertical looms, large wooden frames erected in households or in specialized workshops. The warp threads hang vertically, weighted with clay or stone loom weights, and the weft threads are passed horizontally through them, creating the interlaced structure of the cloth. The process is slow. A skilled weaver might produce a meter or two of cloth in a long day of work, but the results can be remarkably complex and beautiful. Patterns are created by varying the weave structure, by using threads of different colors, by incorporating supplementary decorative threads. Some textiles are plain and utilitarian, used for everyday clothing or for household purposes. Others are elaborate and valuable, intended for elite wear or for use as trade goods. Dyeing is a specialized craft, requiring knowledge of which plants or minerals produce which colors, how to prepare dyes, how to achieve even coloration, and to fix the dyes so they do not wash out or fade. The most prestigious color is purple, produced from murex shells, a process that is extraordinarily expensive and labor-intensive, requiring thousands of shells to produce a small amount of dye. Purple textiles are luxury goods, worn only by the wealthy and powerful, serving as visible markers of status and wealth. Metalworking is both a craft and an art, for bronze objects are not merely functional, but are often decorated with care and creativity. The bronze smiths of Troy work with fire and hammer, with casting and cold working, creating objects that range from simple tools to elaborate display pieces. A bronze knife might have a handle decorated with incised patterns or inlaid with other materials. A bronze pin for fastening clothing might have a finial shaped like an animal or a human figure. Bronze vessels, bowls, cups, jugs, are shaped by hammering sheet bronze over forms or by casting and finishing. These objects are valuable, both for the cost of the metal and for the labor invested in their creation, and they are often passed down through generations as family heirlooms. Jewelry is crafted from precious metals and semi-precious stones, creating objects of considerable beauty and value. Goldsmiths work with thin sheets of gold, hammering and shaping them into beads, pendants, earrings, diadems. Filigree work, where thin wires of gold are shaped into intricate patterns and soldered onto backing sheets, creates effects of remarkable delicacy. Stones, cornelian, agate, lapis, lazuli, amber, are shaped and polished and set into metal settings. The finished jewelry serves multiple purposes: personal adornment, certainly, but also as portable wealth, as gifts that cement social and political relationships, as offerings to the gods. Music is part of Troy's cultural life, though the absence of written musical notation means we can only speculate about what it sounded like. Instruments have been found in Bronze Age contexts: lyres, flutes, drums, and these would have been used in religious ceremonies, at festivals, perhaps at banquets and private gatherings. Music serves to mark special occasions, to create emotional atmospheres, to accompany singing and dancing. Songs are likely both religious, hymns praising the gods, and secular, stories of heroes and famous deeds passed down through oral tradition, the beginnings of the epic poetry that would later flourish in Greek culture. Storytelling is a major form of entertainment and cultural transmission. In the evenings after the day's work is done, people gather to listen to tales told by skilled narrators. These stories serve multiple functions. They entertain. They teach moral lessons. They preserve historical memories. They explain natural phenomena and cultural practices. The stories are not fixed texts but living oral traditions, varying with each telling adapted to the audience and the occasion, yet maintaining core elements that make them recognizable across time. The tellers of these tales occupy an important social role, respected for their memories and their verbal skills, sometimes traveling from community to community, bringing news and stories from distant places. The built environment itself is a form of art and cultural expression. The citadel's architecture is not purely utilitarian, but makes aesthetic statements about power, prosperity, and identity. The carefully dressed stones of the fortifications, the proportions of building facades, the placement of structures to create impressive vistas and ceremonial spaces, all of these reflect conscious design choices, an aesthetic vision of how the city should look and feel. Public spaces are created deliberately, areas where people can gather, where ceremonies can be performed, where the community can see itself as a collective entity. Cultural exchange is constant in a city like Troy, positioned at the intersection of different regional traditions. The artifacts found in Bronze Age Troy show influences from Anatolia, from the Aegean, from the Levant, from regions further east. This is not cultural imperialism or domination, but rather a cosmopolitan mixing, a taking and adapting of elements that seem useful or beautiful or interesting. A pottery style from Mycenae might be adopted and modified to local tastes. A religious practice from the Hittite heartland might be incorporated into local rituals. A musical instrument from the Levant might find its way into Troy's musical traditions. This cultural fluidity, this openness to outside influences, is part of what makes Troy prosperous and dynamic. Yet beneath this openness is a core of local identity, a sense of what it means to be Trojan that is maintained and transmitted across generations. This identity is expressed in language, in the particular gods that are worshipped and the specific forms their worship takes, in traditional stories and songs, in marriage customs and inheritance practices, in 1,000 details of daily life that collectively constitute a distinct culture. The people of Troy are not Greeks, though they trade with Greeks and are influenced by Greek culture. They are not Hittites, though they are part of the Hittite sphere of influence and use Hittite diplomatic protocols. They are Trojans, with their own history, their own traditions, their own sense of who they are and how they fit into the wider world. The political structure of Troy is complex, balancing the authority of the king with the interests of powerful aristocratic families, the needs of the broader population, and the requirements of maintaining relationships with external powers. Understanding how decisions are made, how power is exercised, how conflicts are resolved, provides insight into the internal dynamics of the city and its capacity to respond to challenges. The king, as we have noted, stands at the apex of the political hierarchy, but his power is not absolute. He rules in consultation with a council of aristocrats, men who control substantial resources, who command the loyalty of their own followers, who can either support or obstruct the king's initiatives. This council meets regularly, discussing matters of importance to the city-state, diplomatic relations with foreign powers, military strategy, the allocation of resources, disputes that require high-level judgment, proposed changes to laws or customs. The discussions in the council are not mere formalities where the king announces decisions and expects rubber stamp approval. They are genuine deliberations where different viewpoints are expressed, where arguments are made and debated, where compromises are negotiated. A king who consistently ignores the advice of his council, who makes decisions that are perceived as arbitrary or that serve only his personal interests rather than the common good, risks losing the support of the aristocracy. And without that support, his ability to govern effectively is severely compromised, for he depends on these men to implement his decisions, to provide warriors for military campaigns, to maintain order in the territories they control. The council chamber is located within the palace complex, a room designed to accommodate these gatherings.
It is not elaborately decorated.
for the focus here is on serious business rather than display, but it is dignified and appropriate to the gravity of the proceedings. The king sits in a position of prominence, perhaps on a slightly elevated platform, but the other council members are arranged around him in a configuration that suggests shared authority rather than absolute dominion. The discussions are conducted with formality, following protocols that ensure all voices can be heard, that interruptions are limited, that decisions emerge from consensus rather than from dictation. Diplomatic correspondence is one of the council's major concerns. The clay tablets that arrive from foreign courts must be read and discussed, their implications assessed, appropriate responses formulated. This requires knowledge not just of the immediate content of the messages, but of the broader context of relationships between Troy and the sending power, of past interactions, of ongoing disputes or collaborations, of the relative strength and reliability of different partners. The formulation of responses is a delicate art, for a misjudgment in tone or content can damage relationships that have been carefully built over years or even generations. Treaties are particularly important. In the Bronze Age world, international relations are managed through formal agreements that specify mutual obligations, define territories and spheres of influence, regulate trade and the movement of people, establish protocols for resolving disputes. A treaty between Troy and the Hittite Empire, for example, might recognize Troy's autonomy while acknowledging Hittite suzerainty, specify tribute obligations, promise mutual military assistance against common enemies, and establish procedures for extraditing fugitives or handling merchant disputes. Such treaties are not merely pieces of paper or clay, but are sacred oaths, sworn in the presence of gods, whose violation brings not just political consequences, but religious pollution and divine retribution. The renewal or renegotiation of treaties is a recurrent political challenge, as circumstances change, as kings die and are succeeded by their heirs, as military balances shift, as new threats emerge, existing treaties may become inadequate or disadvantageous. The decision to seek renegotiation, to propose modifications, or to let an existing treaty lapse must be made carefully, weighing the benefits against the risks, considering how such actions will be perceived by other powers, anticipating possible responses. Internal governance also occupies much of the council's attention. The city-state includes not just the citadel and the lower town, but an agricultural hinterland of villages and farmsteads whose inhabitants owe allegiance to Troy. These rural populations must be administered, their disputes resolved, their tribute collected, their security maintained. Local officials, appointed by the king or by aristocrats who control specific territories, handle most day-to-day administration, but more serious matters are referred upward to the council. Justice is an important function of political authority. In a society without codified written laws accessible to the general population, justice depends heavily on precedent, on traditional practices, on the judgments of respected authorities who are seen as wise and fair. Disputes that cannot be resolved at lower levels are brought before the king and his council. These might involve property disputes, disagreements over boundaries, over water rights, over inheritance, or personal conflicts, accusations of theft, of assault, of violations of marriage agreements. The king hears the parties, consults with his advisors, considers relevant precedents, and renders judgment. His decisions are expected to be fair and to reflect established norms, but they also serve to demonstrate his authority and his role as the ultimate arbiter of disputes within his realm. Taxation and tribute are constant concerns. The city's wealth comes from multiple sources, from agricultural production in the territories it controls, from harbor fees and tolls on trade, from tribute paid by dependent communities, from the profits of royal or aristocratic commercial ventures. The collection of these revenues requires administrative infrastructure, records of what is owed, officials who oversee collection, mechanisms for enforcing compliance. The revenues must then be allocated to maintain the palace and its household, to fund military forces, to support religious institutions, to undertake public works, to provide relief during times of famine or disaster. Public works are significant undertakings that demonstrate both the capacity and the priorities of the political authorities. The construction and maintenance of the citadel's fortifications is the most obvious example, a massive investment of labor and materials over many generations. But there are other projects as well. The maintenance of roads and paths that connect Troy to its hinterland and to neighboring territories, the construction of wells and cisterns to ensure water supply, the building and repair of harbor facilities, perhaps irrigation works to increase agricultural productivity. These projects require planning, organization, the mobilization of labor, and sustained investment, all of which depend on effective political authority. Religious institutions are closely tied to political authority. The major sanctuaries are supported by the palace, receiving land grants whose revenues fund sacrifices and priestly salaries, and the king plays a central role in major religious ceremonies. This connection between political and religious authority is mutually reinforcing. The king's participation in rituals demonstrates his piety and his special relationship with the gods, legitimating his political power. Conversely, religious institutions benefit from royal patronage, receiving the resources they need to function and to maintain their own prestige and authority. The relationship between Troy and its neighbors is managed through a combination of diplomacy, trade, and occasional military action. Some neighbors are allies, bound by treaties and by mutual interests in maintaining stability and prosperity. Others are competitors or potential threats, with whom relations are more wary and sometimes hostile. The management of these relationships requires constant attention, an understanding of shifting circumstances, and the ability to respond flexibly to new developments. Marriage alliances are an important diplomatic tool. The children of Troy's royal family and of its aristocratic families are valuable commodities in the marriage market, means by which alliances can be created or reinforced. A daughter married to the son of a neighboring ruler creates a bond between the two families, a relationship that ideally will lead to cooperation and mutual support. These marriages are not love matches, but political arrangements, negotiated carefully to maximize advantage. The bride typically moves to her husband's city, bringing with her a dowry and often continuing to maintain contact with her birth family, serving as a channel of communication and potentially of influence. Succession is a perennial source of political tension. In most Bronze Age kingdoms, power passes from father to son, ideally to the eldest son, though this rule is not absolute and circumstances can lead to other outcomes. The designated heir is often given responsibilities while his father still lives, allowing him to learn the skills of rulership and to build relationships with the aristocratic families whose support will be essential when he takes power. But succession is never entirely secure. Younger sons may challenge their brothers, powerful aristocrats may attempt to place their own candidates on the throne, external powers may intervene to support one claimant or another. The successful management of succession, ensuring a smooth transition of power from one generation to the next, is one of the most important achievements of any political system. The political life of Troy is thus a constant balancing act, managing competing interests, maintaining internal order while projecting external strength, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving core traditions and institutions. It is not a perfect system. There are injustices. There are abuses of power, there are tensions and conflicts that sometimes erupt into violence. But it is functional, providing the organizational capacity that allows Troy to survive and prosper in the challenging environment of the Bronze Age world, and it is through this political structure that the city responds to the greatest challenges it will face. The clouds gather slowly on the horizon, both literal and metaphorical. Troy has enjoyed a long period of relative stability and prosperity. But the late Bronze Age world is entering a time of increasing stress and instability. The signs are subtle at first, easy to dismiss or to rationalize, but over time they accumulate into a pattern of crisis that will challenge Troy's ability to survive. The climate is changing. The wet winters and reliable summers that have supported agriculture for generations become less predictable. Some years the rains fail, and drought withers the crops. Other years, unseasonably heavy rains flood fields and rot grain in storage. The farmers in Troy's agricultural territories struggle to maintain production, and in bad years there are food shortages, forcing the city to draw on reserves or to import grain at high cost from regions that have been more fortunate. Trade becomes more difficult and dangerous. The sea routes that have brought wealth to Troy for so long are increasingly disrupted. There are reports of piracy, of raiders who attack merchant vessels and coastal settlements without warning. Some say these pirates come from the Aegean islands, driven by their own economic desperation. Others claim they are displaced peoples, refugees from conflicts in distant regions, who have taken to the sea because they have nowhere else to go. Whatever their origin, their effect is clear. Maritime commerce becomes riskier and more expensive. Ships travel in larger convoys for protection. Insurance costs rise. Some trade routes are abandoned as too dangerous. There are also disturbing reports from the east, from the Hittite Empire that has been Troy's overlord and trading partner for generations. The empire is facing pressures on multiple fronts: conflicts with Egypt over Syria, rebellions by subject territories, mysterious invasions by groups. The Hittite texts call the Sea Peoples, though who these people are and where they come from remains unclear. The Hittite archives record increasingly desperate pleas for grain, for military assistance, for resources to deal with mounting crises. The empire that has been a source of stability and order in Anatolia is visibly weakening, and its weakness has implications for all the smaller states, like Troy, that have depended on it. Troy's own military forces find themselves more frequently called upon. Raiders appear on the approaches to the city, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses. Some are driven off easily, but others are more persistent and better organized. The king must divert resources from trade and construction to military preparations, strengthening fortifications, maintaining larger garrison forces, organizing patrols of the territory. The cost of security rises, eating into the surplus that has funded Troy's prosperity. There are social tensions as well. The food shortages and economic disruptions fall most heavily on the poorest members of society, while the elite continue to live comfortably in their palaces. Resentments build. There are incidents of theft, of defiance of authority, even occasional riots in the lower town when bread prices spike or when water becomes scarce during droughts. The authorities respond with force but also with concessions, distributing grain from royal storehouses, relaxing some of the burdens of tribute and taxation, trying to maintain social cohesion in the face of mounting pressures. The religious authorities interpret these troubles as signs of divine displeasure. More frequent sacrifices are made, more elaborate rituals performed, seeking to appease whatever gods have been offended, to turn aside whatever cosmic forces are causing these misfortunes. But the troubles continue, suggesting either that the propitiation is inadequate, or that something more fundamental is wrong, something that cannot be fixed through ritual alone. One evening, as the sun sets in a sky streaked with unusual red and orange colors that some take as an evil omen, a messenger arrives at the citadel. He is exhausted, having traveled for days with minimal rest, and his news is urgent. A large force, he reports, has been observed moving through the region, appearing to be heading toward Troy. It is unclear whether this force is an army, a group of migrants, or something else, but it is substantial enough to pose a serious threat. The king convenes his council immediately. The debate in the council chamber is heated. Some advisors argue for immediate military action, for meeting this force in the field before it can reach Troy's walls, for demonstrating strength and deterring any aggressive intentions. Others counsel caution, pointing out that Troy's strength lies in its fortifications, that to venture out and risk a pitched battle would abandon the city's greatest advantage. Still others suggest diplomatic approaches, sending envoys to determine the strangers' intentions, offering gifts and guarantees of safe passage if they will bypass Troy, negotiating to avoid conflict. The king listens to all the arguments, weighing them carefully. He is conscious of the weight of his responsibility, knowing that his decision could determine whether Troy survives this crisis or falls. Finally, he gives his orders. The military forces will be mobilized, but they will remain within the citadel and the lower town's defensive perimeter. Messengers will be sent to allies and to the Hittite authorities, requesting assistance, though given the empire's own troubles, it is unclear what help can be expected. Envoys will approach the strangers, seeking to understand their intentions and, if possible, to negotiate a peaceful resolution. And the population will begin preparations for the possibility of a siege, bringing in the harvest prematurely, if necessary, stockpiling food and water, ensuring that the fortifications are in good repair, drilling the militia in defensive tactics. The next days are tense and busy. The population responds to the emergency with discipline born of long tradition. Farmers from the surrounding territories bring their families and portable goods into the protection of the walls. Livestock is herded into pens in the lower town. Water is drawn from wells and stored in every available vessel. The bronze smiths work long hours producing spearheads and arrowheads. The priestesses perform rituals asking for divine protection. Children are kept close to home, and an atmosphere of nervous anticipation pervades the city. The strangers arrive and establish a camp within sight of the citadel but outside the range of the defenders' missiles. They are a mixed group, clearly not a regular army but not mere bandits either. They have women and children with them, wagons loaded with possessions, the appearance of people on the move rather than raiders seeking plunder. But they are also armed and organized, and their intentions toward Troy are not friendly. The envoys sent by the king return with unsettling news. The strangers demand food, water, and safe passage through Troy's territory. They claim to be refugees, displaced from their homes by wars and disasters in distant regions, seeking new lands where they can settle. But their request has an implicit threat. If Troy does not provide what they ask, they are prepared to take it by force. The council meets again to consider this ultimatum. Providing what the strangers demand would strain Troy's resources, already stretched by the recent crop shortfalls and trade disruptions, but refusing might mean a siege, with all the suffering and destruction that would entail. The debate is long and difficult, with no clearly right answer. Finally, a compromise is reached. Troy will provide some food and water, enough to help the strangers on their way, but not so much as to cripple the city's own reserves. In exchange, the strangers must agree to bypass Troy's territory peacefully and to pose no threat to the city or its people. The agreement is accepted, and for a few days it seems that the crisis will pass without violence. The strangers receive the promised provisions and begin to move on. But then, a new complication arises. A group of young warriors from the strangers' camp, perhaps acting without authorization from their leaders, perhaps simply unable to resist the temptation, raid one of Troy's outlying villages, taking livestock and captives. The violation of the agreement is clear, and it cannot go unpunished without signaling weakness and inviting further aggression. The king sends a force to pursue the raiders, to recover the stolen property and the captives, and to punish those responsible. The pursuit is successful. The raiders are caught, the property recovered, the captives freed. But in the confrontation, blood is shed on both sides, and what might have been resolved peacefully now escalates into open conflict. The strangers, claiming that Troy has attacked them in violation of the agreement, prepare to assault the city. The siege that follows is not the apocalyptic destruction of later legend, but it is serious enough. For weeks, the strangers camp around Troy, cutting off access to the agricultural lands, preventing trade, launching occasional probing attacks against the fortifications. The defenders repel these attacks, but at a cost. Some men are killed or wounded, and the constant vigilance is exhausting. Food supplies, carefully managed, begin to run low. There are debates about rationing, about how long the city can hold out, about whether to send more appeals for help or to attempt a sortie to break the siege. The crisis does not end in a single decisive battle, but rather fades gradually. The strangers, lacking the resources and the expertise for a sustained siege of a well-fortified city, find their position increasingly untenable. Their own food supplies run low, disease breaks out in their crowded camps, and some groups decide to move on in search of easier targets or more hospitable lands. The siege gradually loosens, and eventually, the strangers depart, leaving Troy battered but standing. In the aftermath, there is relief but also a profound sense of unease. Troy has survived, but the experience has revealed vulnerabilities, has shown that the city's prosperity and security cannot be taken for granted, that the world is changing in ways that are not fully understood. The damage to crops and infrastructure must be repaired, the dead must be buried and mourned, the social fabric strained by weeks of stress must be mended, and beyond the immediate recovery, there are longer-term questions about how Troy can adapt to this new, more dangerous environment, whether the strategies that have worked for generations will continue to be adequate, whether the city's best days are behind it, or whether it can find new ways to prosper. The years following the siege are a time of recovery and adaptation, but also of gradual decline. Troy does not collapse suddenly or dramatically. There is no single catastrophic event that brings the city to an end. Rather, it experiences a slow transformation, a wearing away of the prosperity and power that had defined it for so long. The trade networks that had been Troy's lifeblood never fully recover. The disruptions of the late Bronze Age, the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the troubles in the Mycenaean kingdoms, the general breakdown of the organized international trade system, mean that the volume of maritime commerce flowing through the Dardanelles is much reduced from its peak. Ships still come, but fewer of them, carrying smaller cargoes, dealing in more modest commodities. The harbor fees and tolls that had enriched Troy's rulers are reduced accordingly, and with less revenue, it becomes harder to maintain the infrastructure, the military forces, the public works that had made the city function. The population declines. Some families leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere, perhaps hoping to escape the economic stagnation and the lingering threat of violence. Others die, victims of food shortages, disease, or the occasional conflicts that continue to plague the region. The lower town becomes less densely inhabited, with some buildings abandoned, their timber frames collapsing, their foundations eventually covered by wind-blown soil. The citadel continues to be occupied, but even there, the signs of reduced circumstances are visible. Palace buildings that fall into disrepair, fortifications that are inadequately maintained, a general sense of diminishment. The social hierarchies that had structured Troy's society begin to erode. The aristocratic families, their wealth based on trade and tribute that are no longer reliable, find their economic foundations weakened. Some adapt, transitioning to a more agricultural economy, focusing on the direct exploitation of their landholdings rather than on commercial ventures. Others fade into obscurity, their descendants eventually indistinguishable from the common population. The political system becomes less formal and more personal, based on direct relationships of dependence and loyalty rather than on elaborate institutions and protocols. Religion continues to be important, perhaps more so than ever, as people seek explanations for their troubles and hope for better times. The sanctuaries remain active, though the sacrifices become less lavish, the festivals less elaborate. The gods are still worshipped, prayers are still offered, but there is a sense that the divine favor that Troy once enjoyed has been withdrawn, that the city is paying for some ancient offense, real or imagined, that has never been properly expiated. Cultural life becomes simpler and more localized. The sophisticated crafts that had flourished in Troy's heyday, the elaborate pottery, the fine textiles, the skilled metalwork, give way to more utilitarian production. The international influences that had made Troy's material culture so rich and varied are reduced, and local traditions become more dominant by default. The stories told in the evening gatherings change too, becoming more focused on the past, on the memory of a time when Troy was great and prosperous, when its kings were powerful and its walls were invulnerable. These memories, transmitted orally through generations, will eventually become the seeds of the legends that later ages will inherit. The citadel itself undergoes physical changes. Parts of the fortifications collapse, whether from earthquake, from inadequate maintenance, or from violence, is sometimes unclear. New building is less ambitious than in previous generations, often reusing stones from earlier structures, creating a palimpsest where different layers of history are visible in the architecture. The Great Megaron, the palace that had been the center of political and religious life, shows signs of modification and adaptation, perhaps no longer serving its original function, perhaps inhabited by people of reduced status who use it in ways its builders never intended. And then, at some point in this long twilight, the exact date is impossible to determine, there is a final disaster. It might be another siege, more successful than the one the city survived earlier. It might be an earthquake, common in this seismically active region. It might be fire, spreading through the timber frame buildings and leaving nothing but stone foundations and layers of ash. Whatever the cause, the prosperous city we have been exploring, comes to an end. The walls are breached or collapse, the buildings are destroyed, and the site is abandoned, at least temporarily. But this is not quite the end of Troy. The site is too valuable to remain deserted forever. Within a generation or two, people return to the hill, building a new settlement, smaller and poorer than its predecessor. But recognizing the continued strategic importance of the location, this new Troy, which archaeologists will designate as Troy Verva, continues for a time, but it is a shadow of what came before. The great ashlar walls of Troy Vervs are not rebuilt, the elaborate architecture is not recreated. Life continues, but on a reduced scale, in a diminished form. And eventually this too ends. Troy Vimsa suffers its own destruction, perhaps in the great wave of chaos and population movements that sweeps across the eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, the mysterious events that modern scholars call the Bronze Age collapse. The Mycenaean kingdoms fall, the Hittite Empire disintegrates, the trade networks dissolve, literacy is lost in many regions, and the sophisticated Bronze Age civilizations give way to a dark age of reduced population, simplified material culture, and lost knowledge. The site of Troy is abandoned and gradually forgotten. Wind-blown soil covers the ruins, vegetation takes root, and within a few generations what had been a great city becomes just a hill, notable perhaps for its unusual profile, but no longer obviously the site of human habitation. The people who live in the region retain some memories, garbled and transformed by repeated retelling of a great city that once stood here, of wars and heroes, of wealth and disaster. These memories will eventually find their way into the oral traditions that centuries later will be shaped into the epic poetry of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, where Troy will be immortalized not as the real Bronze Age city we have explored tonight, but as the legendary city of gods and heroes. But that is a story for another time. For now we stand at the end of the historical Troy, the city before the legends, watching as the last lights go out, as the final inhabitants depart, as silence descends upon walls that will stand for millennia, waiting to be rediscovered by future generations who will marvel at their massive stones and wonder about the people who built them. The story of Troy does not end with its abandonment in the Bronze Age. The ruins on the hill are rediscovered, built over, and reinterpreted by successive waves of settlers: Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Turks. Each culture leaves its own layer, its own mark on the site, until the original Bronze Age city is buried deep beneath centuries of subsequent occupation. It is only in the 19th century CE, over 3,000 years after the destruction of Troy 6, that archaeologists begin to excavate the site, peeling back the layers of history, revealing the walls and buildings and artifacts that tell the story of the real Troy. The archaeological work at Troy is difficult and complex, for the site has been occupied so many times, each occupation disturbing and obscuring the earlier layers. The pioneering excavator, Henrik Schliemann, driven by a belief in the literal truth of Homer's epics, damages much of the site in his enthusiasm to reach what he believes to be the Troy of the Trojan War. Later excavators are more careful and scientific, using refined techniques to distinguish between different phases of occupation, to date the various layers, to understand the sequence of building and destruction that spans thousands of years. What they find is a city whose reality is both less and more than the legend. There is no evidence for the massive 10-year siege of Greek myth, no proof that Helen of Troy ever existed, no remains of a giant wooden horse, but there is evidence for a prosperous, sophisticated Bronze Age city that controlled a strategic location, that participated in far-flung trade networks, that had diplomatic relations with the great powers of its age, that suffered periodic destructions and rebuildings, that eventually declined and fell during the general collapse of Bronze Age civilization. The real Troy is less dramatic than the legendary one, but in many ways more interesting, for it was inhabited by real people facing real challenges, making real choices, experiencing real triumphs and tragedies.